Opening your eyes slowly, the first memory you have this morning is of draining the last drops from the empty whiskey bottle that you feel is still sitting on your chest. On the roof of your bunk, the classic 20th century Christmas movie you were watching is paused behind a pop-up that reads, "Are you still watching?" You brush the bottle to one side of your bunk and slowly, carefully, you raise your body to sit up. It almost feels like you're floating thanks to the low gravity on this planet. With the ship's power turned off, the artificial gravity inside the ship isn't functioning either, so you hold tightly onto the handles running along the ceiling of the cabin, pulling yourself towards the door of the cockpit a few feet away. A hangover in point 2 of Earth's gravity is even less fun than usual, so you fumble along the wall until you find the button with an embossed capital G and give it a push. Lights flicker as power returns to the ship, and then thunk. You feel like you become an inch or two shorter as artificial gravity engages again, your feet now firmly attached to the ground, as they should be. Back into the bunk to start the day with a sachet of mashed, hydrating nutrients. The green packet always helps get rid of a hangover, so that's your breakfast for today. A private moment to relieve the body of its waste products, and the day can begin. Back into the cockpit, you take a look out of the window to see the barren greyness of the planet you chose as a home last night. Or was it a moon? Looking up, you only see stars, but that isn't a definite answer. The gauge on the wall of the cockpit shows a couple of days of oxygen reserves remaining, plenty enough to get you to the next suitable atmosphere to replenish. The power gauge shows that your new solar converter is working well. No worries there. Heading back through the cabin and onto the cargo hold in the back of the ship, you see the 2 tons of quality liquor is still there, all present and correct, save for the single bottle you took for yourself. You might get away with pretending it's all present at the destination, but even if that one bottle is recognised as absent, the profit from this trade will hardly be affected. You tighten the harnesses again so you don't need to worry about flying smoothly. On the left wall of the cargo hold, you pull away a panel to reveal the shielded cubby for contraband that you had fitted. The half kilo of powder you have stashed there is still untouched, as expected. It's never been your vice, thankfully. Your contact should be working the same dock that you deliver the liquor to, and will add a nice percentage to this run's total profit. So it was a smart decision to accept the delivery contract. Okay, some stretches. Touch your toes and squat. 1, 2, 3. Time to go. Back to the cockpit and into the pilot chair. Perfectly moulded to the shape of your body, it feels like a hug from your best friend. And isn't that what your ship becomes for a long-distance trader like you? You're making good time, but there's no need to delay. Music on, engines powering up. 3, 2, 1, lift off. We're on our way. Ever since the early days of game development, the space game has been a mainstay, with early shooters like Asteroids being an early example of how alluring being a small ship in a vast, mostly empty space can be. The first space simulation game would arrive on the BBC Micro personal computer, at a time when a person's status was directly correlated with the height of their hair, and still before it was discerned by the vibrant colours of your shell suit. Elite, by David Braben and Ian Bell, would go on to be ported to practically every major gaming platform of the 80s, and other space sims, including sequels to Elite itself, would follow in the 90s. There were a handful of new space games in the early 2000s, yet by 2010, it seemed like the genre was at death's door. This isn't a video about the history of space sims, so I won't be looking at this trajectory in detail. I just wanted to provide some brief context for what was to happen in the final months of 2012. But first, a little about why I'm making this video. I have always loved the concept of space sims. Sims in general have always been an interesting concept to me, in fact. Unlike an action game where you are given a mission, dropped in at the point where the action begins, and pulled out when the action stops, in a sim game you carry out all the seemingly mundane tasks that happen in between the action too. Unlike a strategy game where you manage multiple entities from a god's-eye perspective, in a sim game you are an individual with the sole task of managing yourself. It is the ultimate kind of role-playing game, where instead of playing the role of a hero, being given increasingly godlike powers to take down increasingly powerful enemies, you are playing the role of some average Joe, perhaps given the responsibility of controlling the contents of your bladder. Instead of being asked something like, "What if you're a demigod in the epic age of Greek heroes?" you're asked, "What if you're someone like you, but you drive trucks for a living?" Or in the case of a space sim, what if you're someone like you, but space travel is possible, and you happen to own a spaceship? It's a genre that doesn't often translate to a very exciting sales pitch, and that's probably why it can seem like many publishers stopped paying for sim games to be made. It's easy to look at the massive success of a game like Euro Truck Simulator 2, and imagine that a big publishing house like Activision would want to get in on such a moneymaker. It's much more difficult to imagine that they would have been enthused enough to put money down on the "okay, hear me out" pitch of driving cargo through European cities while strictly observing traffic regulations. With that in mind, it seems almost obvious in retrospect that the space sim genre may have struggled to remain relevant in the noughties era of 3D action hegemony. I greatly missed the space sims of my youth, however. I played a lot of the '93 title Frontier Elite 2 on the old Amiga 500, and yet in 2010, if I wanted a similar experience, I would likely end up playing the same game. Or the 1995 sequel First Encounters, which was essentially just the same game. It seems such a shame to me that with all the advances in gaming tech that we saw from the mid-90s up to the 2010s, we couldn't go out and live the spacefaring life of sci-fi fans' dreams. Now, I know I'm being just a little hyperbolic here. There were many space games that might call themselves a space trading sim, that would put themselves in the same category as a game like Elite. The X series by Egosoft is a notable example, and Freelancer would fit many of the criteria of a space sim. EVE Online was a wildly successful MMO that would have also satisfied much of my cravings if I'd only been brave enough to crack out the spreadsheets. Yet none of these were quite the same as Elite had been. Nothing was quite like the open sandbox experience that Elite offered to me in the early 90s. Honestly, I don't even consider these games space sims in the same way that I would consider Elite as one. To clarify my concept then, I should try and summarise what I believe a space sim to be, why I might call Elite Dangerous or Star Citizen a space sim, but not a game like No Man's Sky. In brief, it comes down to a simulation of realistic interactions within the game. If a sense of realism is prioritised even over what many would call fun, then you begin to satisfy the criteria of a sim game. For a space sim, that means realistic traversals of unfathomably large distances, even if the technology used is unlike anything we can hope to see in the real world anytime soon. A journey across a star system requires speeds many times greater than the speed of light, but even with that, it takes a long time to make the journey, and it is within the confines of and always consistent with an established in-universe technology. Other systems must also give a sense of realism, such as flight models or even sound design elements, to give an immersing feeling that, even if it is not at all accurate, is a believable way that the tasks you are doing would be carried out in a similar way if they were carried out in the real world. In the space sim genre then, the standard bearer has always been the Elite franchise, a Marmite-like product that for people who believe a game must always prioritise fun can be a repellent game, but for those of us who wish we lived in a spacefaring age, provides us with the closest experience possible in our own day. While the mid-90s had seen a reasonable amount of choice in this genre then, by 2010 many of us were mourning the demise of the space sim. I was not the only person to mourn the loss of a gaming genre then, as evidenced by what was to happen in 2012. First, in October 2012, Chris Roberts would launch his Star Citizen Kickstarter, promising a single-player space adventure in Squadron 42 and an expansive space sim MMO in Star Citizen. Soon after, in November 2012, David Braben would launch his Elite Dangerous Kickstarter, promising a space sim MMO alone. I chose not to back this Star Citizen Kickstarter initially because it didn't need me to get funded anyway, and Chris Roberts, even then, had a bit of a reputation as someone unable to rein in his ambitions and actually finish projects. I backed the game a little later, in August 2015, with a package that gave me a Mustang starter ship as well as both games for an enticing price of, if my memory serves correctly, about £25. Over the years, I've dropped in on the game every now and again to see what progress has been made, and I never regretted my purchase, even upgrading my pledge to the excellent Avenger Titan starter ship during a period of extended playtime for me in 2021. Again, no regrets. I feel like I got value from the purchase I made, even if the game never actually finishes. I did back Elite. They struggled to get the funding required, and I just really wanted to play an Elite game made in the modern era of gaming. When it came out in December 2014, I jumped into the game and oohed and ahed at the pretty stars and what still ranks as some of the best sound design in any game, in my humble opinion. Over the years, I purchased Horizons and eventually Odyssey. I participated in some of the excellent community initiatives like Distant Worlds 2. I made billions of credits in the Buran Low Temp Diamonds Rush and proudly donated my fleet carrier to the ongoing Deep Space Support Array, an exploration service that has given commanders a place of safety many thousands of light years away from that area of heavily populated systems around Sol, known as the Bubble. At the time of writing, my carrier alone has repaired 1,232 ships at a distance just short of 25,000 light years from Sol. In short, I love the game. I love both games, and I want to see them both thrive. Yet, thrive is not a word that we might associate with either game right now. If you ask a fan of Star Citizen, they may tell you that 2023 was the best year yet for the game, and 2024 is shaping up to be even better. I would agree with that sentiment, but the game is still seemingly nowhere near release. It suffers from bugs and performance issues that only seem to get worse as more features are crammed into the game, and it would be remiss of me to neglect to mention the controversy surrounding its monetization. The crowdfunding model has provided vast funds towards its development that will ensure that, when it is finally released, it will be the most expensive game ever developed. Some people call it a scam, which is not really accurate. The game is under active development, that is certain, so there is no bait and switch going on here. But the question of whether it will ever actually resemble a final product is a fairer question. The scope of game that Chris Roberts set out back in 2012 seems to be coming together, but it certainly hasn't been met until you can play the game, like a game. In comparison, you might think that Elite Dangerous stacks up rather well. It is a stable game that you can play for thousands of hours right now, with progression that isn't rendered finite by expected server wipes or crashes. Yet the game sees daily player counts at a fraction of its height, with the latest expansion having the perverse effect of cutting its player count significantly compared to before the expansion was released. Odyssey made obvious the glaring flaws in ED development. It claimed to provide a long asked-for feature, space legs, but it exists in a strange parallel state to the rest of the game. Rather than adding to the existing experience, it sits alongside it and detracts from the core experience. We got more grind, perhaps the worst grind yet, in a game regularly charged with already having some of the worst grind in MMOs. It performed terribly at launch and betrayed a preference for pleasing shareholders rather than its players, obviously releasing too early in order to meet a promise to shareholders to release the expansion within a certain fiscal year. It saw the end of console support for the game, and the lack of care for VR support. Imagine having what is widely considered the most robust and in-depth game in the nascent VR gaming industry, and not factoring that into your latest expansion to that game, maybe even diminishing that quality so that your half-baked, third-rate FPS gameplay X-Pack can get a release window that makes your studio's financials look temporarily healthy. The player base felt rightly abused, and many ditched the game in response. God, I genuinely love this game, but it still makes me unreasonably angry that the studio seemingly doesn't care about its major IP. It leads me to believe, and I doubt I'm alone in this, that the biggest problem that Elite Dangerous has is frontier developments. Okay, I need to step back a little. This always happens to me when I get to talking about Elite. My sentiment over the current state of the game, the way the game is being handled, overrides whatever point I want to make, and I just succumb to complaining about it. I'm not the only one that happens to, as you can see on the forums, on Reddit, in YouTube comments, but let's try not to do that here. So, regardless of the health of the current space sims, I believe that many would agree that there is a big issue with the space sim genre. You may not all agree on what that problem is, but I'll set out what I believe that is here. Essentially, the genre promises so much but only ever fails to deliver on that promise. In the past, in the era of Frontier Elite 2, the limitations of the machines we used were so obvious that perhaps our expectations were set by them. Yet the machines of today are capable of so much more than what we have achieved. So why? Well, the obvious first problem is money. How on earth are you going to meet the expansive promise of a space sim without raising $1 billion in funding and spending 12 to 15 years in development? Well, I guess we can wait to see if CIG achieves the promise with those things. But I'd forgive you for having serious doubts. The bigger problem is maybe even more obvious, and is, in my opinion, the real problem with creating a believable space sim. Scale. There are not enough game developers in the world to satisfy a level of handcrafted detail that we might want to emulate a real populated planet. In Star Citizen there are currently a small handful of planets and moons, all handcrafted and diverse and impressive for it. If you're on the planet of ArtCorp, you can see City occupying practically the whole surface. It is absolutely understandable that the player accessible areas are a relatively minute part of that planet. ArtCorp is certainly the extreme example, but even with the other planets there are limits to where a player can go in the ostensibly high detailed areas and large areas of relatively low detail, although almost always still very pretty. I want to be clear, I'm not trying to denigrate from what CIG has achieved with these planets. The detail achieved thus far is truly impressive, and the diversity of biomes on the landable planets in Star Citizen is already, even with only one playable star system, far more than what you get with Elite's landable planets. It should be no surprise then that the scale problem is even more obvious with Elite. A very common charge sent in the direction of Elite has always been the wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle issue. It's certainly not unjustified. The planets that you can get up close with in Elite are all a variety on a single theme, a dull, lifeless, rocky theme. There is life on some planets, I hear some say, but the small clumps of brain trees, somehow dotted throughout the galaxy, but only in forests a few meters wide on a single planet, are not offering up a high level of detail. In fact, I would argue they make the fairly believable rocky planet a lot less believable, and maybe a little immersion breaking. This might sound a bit negative, and maybe it is, a bit. But it's also understandable when you recognise that the game world for Elite Dangerous is an approximation of the entire Milky Way galaxy. Star Citizen has one currently playable star system with a few more on the way. Elite, however, has 400 billion, with a B. This is the issue of scale pushed to an extreme. A high level of detail across all of these 400 billion star systems is just never going to happen. It's not like Frontier Development stumbled into this issue without any foresight, obviously. While Chris Roberts always intended to have handcrafted star systems, and maybe we could say that his ambition was getting the better of him when he added the promise of 100 star systems on launch as a stretch goal to the Star Citizen Kickstarter, this was never David Braben's intention with Elite Dangerous. Instead, Frontier Developments utilised procedural generation to create the billions of star systems in the Milky Way. It couldn't have been done in any other way. This approach was fitting for Elite Dangerous, as the first Elite game from 1984 is known as a pioneer of this tool. Not quite the first to use it, Rogue used a form of that tool to generate its dungeons in 1980 for example, but certainly the grandest use at the time. For what it's worth, I wish that Elite Dangerous utilised procedural generation for more things. With the Odyssey expansion came the opportunity to get off your ship and into the various spaceports. The novelty of this quickly wears very thin, however, when you realise that there are just 3 layouts to these spaceports: the largest space stations, those which are big enough to accept all flyable ships, the smaller ports that only accept small or medium ships, and the ground ports. As far as I've seen, these are the 3 versions of stations, and I don't know why a small measure of procedural generation wasn't employed to generate some limited variety. The issue of scale doesn't simply have an effect on the generation of scenery, however. The problem of scale also rears its head in gameplay, and particularly in quest or mission design. Your average MMORPG will give you a vaguely plausible reason why you need to collect 25 elf butts. The aim is often less about making the player see the logic of the request, although that is sometimes provided, but rather a way of entrenching the player into the role of the helpful adventurer. It seems like this wasn't a consideration for most of Elite's missions though. The mission board is occupied by the same handful of mission types regardless of which station you're in, and there is no real character that you interact with to get these missions. In WoW, you might feel a connection to poor old Mankrik in his search for his missing wife. In Elite, your mission giver doesn't pretend not to be a robot. Station Commander General Averageman is certainly no Mankrik. Again, it's no surprise that this has to be the case to some extent. The amount of populated star systems is a fraction of the total 400 billion star systems in the game. But that fraction still represents an unreasonably large amount of, and I'm using this term very generously, NPCs. As much as the procedural nature of the mission generation is understandable due to this scale, I do believe that there was always room for proper questlines to be a part of Elite as well. And, in particular, the progression of Federation and Empire ranks should absolutely have a handcrafted questline with unique quests that help that process stand out from the rest of the game. Anyway, regardless of my desire to see at least some handcrafted quests in the game, it should be obvious that because of the vast scale of a space sim, a high level of detail across the board is almost impossible to attain. The level of detail in Star Citizen is impressively high given this, and that's a testament to the handcrafted design that has gone into the Stanton star system. But if anyone believes that CIG will be able to keep that backer promise to provide 100 star systems at launch, well, I don't know why you would still believe that. Elite, on the other hand, doesn't aim for a high level of handcrafted detail. In the generation of planets, they go for a procedural generation solution, and for other content they seem to aim for a small handful of variations and call it a day. So, given the difficulty of achieving detail in a vast world, what could a development studio do to get closer to filling out their game world? Before 2023, I fervently believed that to reach full potential, a space sim, or any game that wanted vast scale, would need to draw on the creativity of its players. Perhaps no other studio can appreciate the power of the crowd in the same way as CIG, who has managed to fund, so far, 12 years of development, building to a size of over 1,100 employees by July 2023. When the promised base building comes in, then it won't just be the money of the crowd that is being milked by CIG, but also the creativity of the crowd too. That once barren moon will become occupied by multiple player-built huts, though the purpose of them is unclear at this point. Elite has community contributions too, of course. That massive Distant Worlds event I took part in, completely player-driven, organised on forums and Discord. Shout out to Fleecom. You want to figure out a good trade route in your space trucking game? Then check your browser. No, not the in-game browser, that's not a thing. The internet doesn't exist anymore in the 3300s. I mean your actual browser. Load up inara.cz and spare a thought for the recently deceased but still loved EDDB. You want a questline? Well, the game itself won't give you one, but the community got your back. Check out Elite, this is French, so I'm not going to say it right, elitedangerous.fr. The website has support for French, Spanish, Italian and English though, thankfully, so at least a dummy like me can read them right. The community surrounding this game has already provided so much content, but right now it requires you to be outside the game to fully engage with it, which is certainly a shame. That is why I, before 2023, thought that what the game needed was to more explicitly open it up to player contributions. allow players to create storylines and missions that can be posted in-game alongside the procedurally generated missions already provided. Back in the old days, there was a feature known as Foundry Quests in the relatively popular MMORPG Neverwinter. I haven't played the game in years, and only ever for a few hours really, but that feature always stuck out as a genius idea for an MMO. Essentially, player created quests with a handy ranking system so that you could see what was worth experiencing at a glance. Your development team can't hope to provide your game with an amount of content that could satisfy the voracious appetite of a dedicated player base. So why not offer a never-ending stream of quests from an imaginative community? Elite has that imaginative community. They demonstrate that at every opportunity, but Frontier doesn't really tap into the benefits that could bring. It's not just quests either. Allow player trading or allow our fleet carriers to both buy and sell at the same time, and a player-to-player economy will become a source of emergent gameplay. Put a web browser in the game, and suddenly every community-driven website surrounding Elite is a feature of the game itself. Anyway, before 2023, I believe that this opening up to the community was the only way to make a giant game world like Elite feel really occupied, at least somewhat. I don't believe that anymore. Now, I want to quickly follow that statement up with saying that I think community creativity can still add significant value to a game world, but the power of a vast crowd is now simply not the only way to generate large amounts of meaningful content. We now have increasingly effective AIs too. Cards on the table, I personally believe that we'll have AGI in the public realm by the end of 2024. I think it's very likely to have already been developed internally at OpenAI, at least to some definitions. If so, then it will be the latest technology to significantly change the world in many ways, and game development is certainly not immune to those changes. But even before that point, the technology that we have access to right now can already do that. This will scare many people, but technological advances don't meekly ask for permission before steamrolling over everything you know and love. Further, I think that it is unstoppable, and no amount of regulation would effectively prevent its progress now. If it is unstoppable, a response of fear is at best pointless, and at worst irresponsible. I'm not being a pro-AI accelerationist or an anti-AI decelerationist, I guess, but I believe that if a technological advance is unstoppable, then the only reasonable approach to the technology is to guide it responsibly rather than fail to stand in its way. Those are my cards. I'm not sure they're a winning set in any game. There will no doubt be broad disagreement with my belief, which is fine, but even with the currently available technology, game development is already changing. The large language models that have already been released are great at certain tasks, and of course not so great at other tasks. One thing they are perhaps best at, however, is analysing existing code and writing new code. A fairly common suggestion I've seen in the various Elite Dangerous communities is that they are sitting on a vast plate of spaghetti code, and that those developers who wrote the initial codebase back in 2014 are no longer with the company, and therefore knowledge about how things work is already lost. I've looked around the internet for real evidence of this, from company insiders for example, and found none so far, so I doubt this is really true. If it was true, however, then if I was Frontier, the first thing I would have wanted to do with our existing AI technologies is to ask for concise documentation of their codebase. Existing public LLMs could not be trusted to provide full documentation of something as large as the Elite Dangerous codebase, but an internally deployed LLM trained specifically on the data required to understand that codebase is a very different beast. If a loss of understanding of the codebase had ever been a problem for Frontier or for any other gaming company, then the introduction of powerful LLMs spells the end of that problem. Of course, someone would need to go through the homework of the LLM to check that it makes sense, but that, I would expect, is significantly less work than a human doing all the work itself. As well as simply analysing and summarising code, however, that same LLM with specific training on a live codebase could be deployed to clean up the code or write new code within that environment. You want to introduce a new feature to your game, then your best first step might be to ask your LLM to write it. Now you're likely going to need some heavy oversight of the results at this stage, but it will, again, be significantly quicker to ask for an LLM to create a starting point than asking a human to do that task. I imagine by the end of 2024 we will have plenty of examples of AI-generated shovelware games that will handily demonstrate why some talented oversight is still necessary. But there will also likely be many examples of AI-generated code in our games that we don't even question. Even with a requirement of human oversight over newly developed code, however, AI code generation will be significantly quicker and cheaper than human code generation. So I believe that AI technologies will soon offer much quicker and more reliable coding, and as much as this might make some people very uncomfortable, a shareholder cares very little about how uncomfortable their money making makes you, and a developer will use whatever tools make their job easier. In other words, it will happen and we can't stop it. But there is also a significant increase in the capability to generate content incoming too, and that is a little more pertinent to this video. My earliest introduction to LLMs was AI Dungeon, like I expect a lot of people's was. My mind was blown at the time, and already now it looks so quaint how impressed I was at its capabilities. As a content creation device, the potential seemed awesome in every sense of that word. The first thought I had was, cool. The second thought followed quickly after and was more like, oh, what does this mean for our authors, for our narrative designers? In the years since, obviously that concern has stretched to include all the creative industries and beyond. Now at the point where I recognise that this thing is coming regardless of how we feel about it, I want to introduce a little nuance into that concern. Sure, any human is going to be able to produce significantly less quantity of output, but the output of human hands and minds aren't going to be completely devalued. People will still value the output of their favourite author, their favourite narrative designer, musician, artist, etc. And human-made creativity is never going away for as long as humans are a thing. We enjoy being creative as a rule. We get a meaningful sense of worth from the creative process, and that's the case whether or not a machine can do it better than a human. But when a game needs a large amount of content very quickly, then expect an AI to be used. Expect it to largely be algorithmically generated content. Thinking about this in respect to Elite Dangerous narrative content is quite interesting. Firstly, because the majority of Elite players will be asking, what narrative content? As I've already alluded to, Elite doesn't have much of an explicit in-game narrative. Sure, there is a Thargoid war going on right now. There have always been Galnet articles telling you what is going on in the galaxy, even if you can't actually witness most of it. But when you pick up a mission, it is obviously just a procedurally generated task, created without the input of a human, beyond the development of the code that generates that mission. As is expected for a game world this size, obviously. But if we are asking machines to generate a simple mission, can't we go the extra mile to give it a little more context within the world? If you're going to finally create a storyline to accompany the Federation or Empire rank grinds in the game, then I think it makes sense to have a handcrafted storyline. A respected lore master for the game, someone like Drew Wager for the Elite universe, is going to add value to that storyline just by association to it, a value that can never be attained by an LLM. But for random quests across the world, missions from the mission boards or random quest offerings, we already have the offerings from a machine, and machines are capable of much better now than they were when these features were implemented into the game. So, what might these AI-generated missions look like? Using the term AI here feels like a misnomer, because there is no need for an actual intelligence to be involved in this process, and current technology is not really an artificial intelligence. But regardless, what could our current technology produce? Well, right now the missions provided can be broken down into the task requested, such as mining 171 units of bromellite, the rewards, which may be adequate and enticing or not. For a mining mission it's rarely, if ever, worth it, being honest. And the narrative component, which for the mission I'm showing now amounts to a single generic line of text. We have a mining contract that we hope you can fulfill for us. So, in case it's not obvious, the rewards are fine. Effective remuneration can be debated, but it's a fairly subjective calculation for each player to make. The task is fine, utilising the gameplay features provided to give a player something to do for a while. The problem is obviously that calling the narrative element a narrative element is extremely generous. It's worth mentioning that the mission shown on screen is for a faction that I am currently friendly with, meaning I've already worked with them a few times. This is how Advisor Lyra Harding talks to a friend. It is this area that needs work in Elite Dangerous, and it has always been in this area. We may underestimate the extent by which this affects things, especially as many of us MMO players have at some point skipped the narration to just get to the task reward component of a given quest. But without it, there is no sense of life in your game world. What does Lyra Harding need specifically 171 units of bromellite for? Why is there a threat level 8? What does a threat level even mean in this context? How will completing this task help this faction or undermine their enemies? This request sounds like it comes from a relatively dumb robot. Lyra certainly looks like a robot. And why am I accepting missions from this robot? Other missions in Elite may come into you while you're flying around. You will get a message sent to you. Sometimes it's to offer an alternative way to complete an already accepted mission. Other times it's an entirely new mission. There is more reason provided for the mission than you get from the board, so that's a boon to the narrative component. But once accepted, it is exactly the same as any other mission. I'll be honest, I've accepted one of these missions just once. They usually come through to me when I'm out doing something already. It is a good addition to the possible missions though, even if I never take advantage of them. So, returning to that question, how could our current LLMs help make these more engaging and help to give the illusion of a living world? Well, what if the initial request comes with a narrative component that reflects the request in the mission and gives us a plausible in-universe reason for the request? Why it would help this faction, a recognition of who you are to this faction, and maybe even a reference to how you've helped or hindered them in the past. These sort of things are already tracked on your account, with your faction standing being viewable at any point. So my amateur understanding of these things suggests that it wouldn't require too much change for an NPC to reference that which is already tracked. All this would help me to believe that these NPCs are slightly less robotic. But this isn't the full potential. I've so far only completed the first quest available on elitedangerous.fr. It uses in-game snippets of lore, small amounts of text retrieved from scanning points of interest in the current game world, to produce an engaging multi-phase narrative questline. The in-game elements for this quest are travel, scanning a system to find the point of interest, scanning the point of interest for clues, and cargo retrieval and selling of said cargo. The additional elements provided by the website are a narrative through-line that ties each of the game elements together, voice acting for the text snippets, and tracking of completed phases. It sounds very simple, but it's the meat added to mere bones, and it creates an enjoyable experience. Seriously, if you're looking for something to do in-game, then this is definitely worth a try. It's what's being played in the footage in the background of most of this video. The big downside is that this narrative throughline exists on an external website, and while it's certainly not necessary, you will benefit from having a second monitor. It left me wondering why this was left to the community. Why couldn't this have been an in-game quest started from an in-game NPC in the bar of Ross 154's Birkland City Station? I'm sure the commanders behind the website, Commander Thargosu and Commander Optimus Koala, are happy to do the work. If there's anything I know about the Elite community, it's that they are a creative bunch who love to add to the world in some way. But when Frontier put in the work to add these snippets of lore already, why would they not extend the game experience by turning them into proper quests? It's this sort of thing where I see the value of current LLMs adding to the Elite game world more explicitly. Connect all of the snippets of lore into coherent multi-phased quests. Give it the means to create new points of interest and generate new quests, and you will soon fill occupied space, the bubble, Colonia, and the other small pockets of occupied space, with meaningful content that exposes the lore of the game world without the need of watching a YouTuber's lore breakdown. Let your players play the lore and give them more of it. It's work that could of course be done by a team of humans at Frontier, but it's evident at this point that this isn't something that Frontier is willing to fund. So I expect that the only way that this will be done internally now is by use of LLMs. Either that or have a team at Frontier slowly work through the amazing community contributions to get their efforts into the game world. So, at the end of this rambling mess that I'll be calling a video essay, what do I have to say in conclusion? The promise of a space sim has never been fully met, and it has been received wisdom that it never will be for a long time. There is a certain size of game world past which we can never hope it to be sufficiently filled by the handcrafted attempts of all the developers of the world. Inviting player creativity into the game can certainly help to fill a larger game world, and that is something that many studios invite eagerly, recognising the value it can add to their game world. Simply something like the base building that many are expecting to arrive in Star Citizen this year is an example of how player creativity can be introduced. But I genuinely hope that something like Neverwinter's Foundry Quest system finds its way into many more games, and especially space sims. Yet, even this cannot hope to fill a game world like that found in Elite Dangerous. Filling a galaxy with content of a reasonable quality will take machines. It will take an expansion of procedural generation so that more depth is provided. On the face of it, and in the minds of a disillusioned player base, it may sometimes seem that the golden age of modern space sims is already past, and was never fully realised. But I want to suggest that it may actually be in the very near future. Those on the Star Citizen hype train will look at the expected features for that game and say, of course the golden age of space sims is in the future, and it will be called Star Citizen. But I want to suggest that the currently released space sim of Elite Dangerous still could reach its potential and become the game it deserves to be. Whether by player-generated content, AI-produced content, or preferably a combination of the two, the era of large-scale being a hindrance to game depth is soon going to become a thing of the past. And we don't need an Elite Dangerous 2 to get there. It's worth acknowledging that this is very much a vibes-based video essay, not one grounded in objective facts. Some will look at the current game and see it as a perfectly sufficient. A complete game, whereas others will be like me and see it as unfortunately wide and shallow, as getting close to but ultimately missing its potential. That's fine. All I'm really saying is that missed potential doesn't need to remain missed. As I leave you, I should make the point that if you want to experience the joys of a space sim, then you can certainly get a valuable experience from these games today. Star Citizen may not be finished, but there is enough there to get a lot of fun out of it even at this point. Don't get too attached to anything you buy in game and be open to playing with the community, and then the game can already offer enough to be your main game. Elite Dangerous might feel like it's in a precarious position to most veteran players, but if you're a new player, you probably won't feel that precarity until after you've sunk 1,000 hours into the game. If you want to understand the scale of our Milky Way galaxy from a layman's perspective, then there is no better way than playing Elite Dangerous in my opinion. Odyssey isn't even really as bad as my sentiment of it, it just happened to not be what I wanted, if I'm being fair. And while these two are my preference, they don't need to be yours, with many other options ready to give you that compelling, that enticing, maybe even addictive feeling of being lost in a hostile expanse of nothingness.